Dylan opened the note. Read it. Said nothing. Just lifted his head and found the 72-year-old man in the crowd. And the concert changed. The venue was small. Theater seating for maybe 300 people. Not an arena. Not a festival. Just a room where sound traveled honestly and faces were visible from the stage. Bob Dylan was 78 years old. Still touring. Still performing. The never-ending tour they called it, a title he'd never chosen but couldn't escape. Night after night. City after city. The same ritual for decades. Tonight was Minneapolis. November 2019. Cold outside. Warm in the theater. The audience settled into their seats with that particular reverence people bring to Dylan concerts. The understanding that you don't come to be entertained. You come to witness. Dylan was backstage. Not preparing. Just waiting. He'd stopped preparing years ago. You either knew the songs or you didn't. You either had something to say or you didn't. A security guard approached. Young guy. Nervous. Mr. Dylan, someone asked me to give you this. He held out an envelope. Old. The kind of paper that yellows with time. Dylan's name written on the front in shaky handwriting. Dylan took it without comment. Turned it over. No return address. Just his name. He opened it slowly. Inside, a single piece of paper. 4 lines. Handwritten. The same shaky letters. Dylan read it once. Then again. His face didn't change, it rarely did, but something in his posture shifted. A weight settling. Who gave you this? His voice quiet, rough from decades of smoke and singing. Older man. Said he's been coming to your shows for 50 years. Said you wouldn't remember him, but he needed you to read this before tonight. Dylan folded the note carefully. Put it in his jacket pocket. Said nothing else. The security guard waited for instructions that never came. Dylan just stood there, hand resting over the pocket where the note now lived, staring at something beyond the dressing room walls. 5 minutes later, he walked onto the stage. Dylan didn't explain himself. He never did. The band was already in position. Guitar, bass, drums. They'd played together long enough that words weren't necessary. Dylan picked up his acoustic guitar, stepped to the microphone. The audience applauded. That sustained, knowing applause of people who understood this might be one of the last chances they'd get. Dylan didn't acknowledge it. He adjusted the microphone stand. Looked out at the faces in the dim theater lighting. And then he did something he rarely did. He spoke. There's someone here tonight. His voice barely above a conversational volume. Who wrote me a note? The room went completely silent. Dylan speaking to the audience like this, addressing them directly, personally, was not part of the script. This didn't happen. He's been coming to shows for 50 years. Dylan's eyes scanned the crowd, moving across rows, searching. 50 years. And he never said anything. Never came backstage. Never asked for anything. Just came. Listened. Left. Somewhere in the 4th row, a man sat very still. 72 years old. Wearing a simple jacket and button-down shirt. His hands gripping the armrests of his seat. Dylan's eyes found him. Held. Until tonight. The man in the 4th row looked like he might stand up. Might leave. Might disappear the way he'd been disappearing after Dylan concerts for half a century. But Dylan's gaze kept him there. The note says. Dylan paused, hand moving to his jacket pocket, touching the paper through the fabric. The note says he should have spoken up in 1969. Should have told me the song mattered. Should have said thank you when it could have changed something. The audience didn't move. 300 people holding their breath. It says he's sorry he waited. Dylan let that sit in the air. Then he turned to his band. A slight nod? They understood immediately, the way musicians who've played together for years understand everything in gestures. Dylan's fingers found the guitar strings. A chord. Simple. Old. and he began to play a song he hadn't performed in over 40 years. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. To understand what happened in that theater, you need to understand what happened in 1969. Bob Dylan wasn't Bob Dylan yet. Not the way the world would come to know him. He was 20 years old. Already famous. Already burdened. The voice of a generation, they called him, a title he never asked for and resented carrying. He'd just released Nashville Skyline. Softer than his earlier work. Less protest. More personal. The critics were confused. The fans were divided. Where was the anger? Where was the revolution? Dylan didn't care. Or maybe he cared too much and had learned to pretend he didn't. He was doing a small radio interview in Minneapolis. College station. Tiny studio. The kind of appearance his management scheduled to seem accessible even though accessibility terrified him. The interviewer was young. Earnest. Asked the usual questions about meaning and message, and what the songs were trying to say. Dylan gave the usual non-answers. Deflected. Redirected. Refused to explain. But don't you feel a responsibility? The interviewer pressed. To the people who listen? To use your voice for. I don't have a voice. Dylan interrupted, his tone flat, tired. I have a guitar and some words. People hear what they need to hear. That's not my responsibility. The interview ended awkwardly. Dylan left through the back exit to avoid fans who might be waiting. But there was one person there. Standing by the alley door in the cold Minneapolis evening. A young man. Early 20s. Thin jacket. Nervous energy. Dylan noticed him, kept walking. Mr. Dylan? The young man called out. Not loud. Just enough. Dylan stopped. Didn't turn around. I just wanted to say the song. The one about the Tambourine Man. The young man's voice cracked. It's the only thing that made sense when my brother died. Dylan's shoulders tensed. He still didn't turn. I wanted you to know it mattered. In case no one tells you that. It mattered. For a long moment, Dylan stood there in the alley. The young man waited, hoping for acknowledgement. A word. Anything. Dylan got into the waiting car and left. He never responded. Never turned around. Never said thank you or I'm sorry or I understand. The young man stood in the alley alone, watching the taillights disappear. His name was Michael Brennan. He was 22 years old. His older brother had died in Vietnam 6 months earlier. He'd played Mr. Tambourine Man at the funeral because it was the only thing that felt true enough. He'd wanted Bob Dylan to know that. But Dylan drove away. And Michael Brennan went home. And neither of them spoke about that night again. Away from the spotlight, Dylan made a choice no one expected. 50 years passed. Michael Brennan got older. Got married. Had children. Built a quiet life in Minneapolis working as a high school English teacher. He played Dylan's music in his classroom sometimes. Taught poetry using song lyrics. Never mentioned the night in the alley. But he kept going to concerts. Every time Dylan came through Minneapolis, which wasn't often, but often enough, Michael would buy a ticket. Sit quietly. Listen. Leave. He never tried to go backstage again. Never wrote letters. Never sought recognition. He just showed up. And every time, he carried the same question, should I have said it differently? Should I have tried harder? Would it have mattered? By 2019, Michael was 72. His wife had passed 3 years earlier. His children were grown with families of their own. He'd retired from teaching. Time had become something different, less a progression forward and more a collection of moments revisited. When he saw that Dylan was coming to Minneapolis again, he bought a ticket like always. But this time, he did something he'd never done. He wrote a note. 4 lines. Handwritten on paper from an old notebook he'd kept since the 1970s. I should have spoken up in 1969. Should have told you the song mattered. Should have said thank you when it could have changed something. I'm sorry I waited. He folded it into an envelope. Wrote Dylan's name on the front. At the theater before the show, he'd approached the security guard. Could you make sure he gets this? Before the show? It's important. The security guard had taken it, probably expecting nothing would come of it. But Dylan had read it. And now, standing on stage in front of 300 people, Dylan was playing a song he hadn't played in 41 years. The audience recognized it slowly. The older ones first. Then whispers spreading. Eyes widening. Phones stayed in pockets. This wasn't a moment to record. This was a moment to witness. Michael Brennan sat in the fourth row, tears streaming down his weathered face, watching Bob Dylan play the song he'd played at his brother's funeral in 1969. Dylan's voice was different now. Rougher. Older. The words carried weight they hadn't carried when he'd first written them. Time does that. Adds gravity to things that once felt light. He didn't look at Michael while he played. Dylan rarely made eye contact during performances. But Michael could feel it anyway, the acknowledgement. The answer that had taken 50 years to arrive. When the song ended, Dylan didn't pause for applause. He just moved into the next song like nothing had happened. But everything had happened. What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, long after the sound faded. After the concert, Michael didn't try to find Dylan. Didn't wait by the stage door. Didn't seek closure beyond what had already been given. He just walked out into the cold Minneapolis night, got into his car, and drove home. But something had shifted. The question he'd carried for 5 decades, should I have said it differently, had been answered. Not with words. With music. With the only language Dylan had ever really spoken. Dylan never mentioned the note in interviews. Never explained why he'd played that particular song that night. People who wrote about the concert noted it was unexpected, significant, moving. They didn't know why. 2 months later, Michael Brennan died peacefully in his sleep. Heart failure. His daughter found the concert ticket stub on his nightstand, next to a photograph of his brother in uniform. She didn't know the significance. But she kept both. Dylan heard about it. Networks of fans share these things, stories travel, but he didn't comment. Didn't issue a statement. Didn't acknowledge it publicly. But 3 months after Michael's death, during a concert in Chicago, Dylan played that same song again. And then again in Boston. And again in Philadelphia. It had come back into his rotation. A song he'd avoided for 4 decades suddenly reappearing like something remembered. People who'd been following Dylan for years noticed. Wondered why. Speculated. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. The note still exists. Dylan kept it. Not in a frame. Not displayed. Just folded in a drawer somewhere among tour schedules and set lists, and the accumulated debris of decades on the road. Sometimes during soundcheck, band members noticed Dylan pull something from his jacket pocket. An old piece of paper. He reads it. Folds it back up. Says nothing. They've learned not to ask. Because some conversations don't need words. Some debts get paid in music. Some apologies take 50 years but arrive exactly when they're needed. Bob Dylan is still touring. Still playing. The never-ending tour continues. And somewhere in the set list, between classics and deep cuts, that song appears. The one he didn't play for 40 years until an old man wrote 4 lines and waited in the 4th row. The one that reminds everyone who hears it. It's never too late to say the things that matter. Even if it takes 50 years. Dylan never explains why he plays it now. He doesn't need to. The people who were there that night in Minneapolis know. The people who heard about Michael Brennan understand. And the ones who don't, they feel it anyway. That's how Dylan's music works. You don't need to know the story to carry the weight. Michael's daughter attended a Dylan concert once, years after her father died. She heard the song. She didn't know it was the same one from the funeral photograph she'd found. But she cried anyway. Dylan saw her from the stage. An older woman, fourth row, tears on her face. He didn't know who she was. But he understood. Some conversations echo across generations. Some thank yous arrive after the person who needed to hear them is gone. But they still matter. Dylan keeps the note. Keeps playing the song. Keeps touring. Not because he owes anyone anything, but because 50 years ago, a young man stood in an alley and tried to say something true. And Bob Dylan finally answered.